The Monterey Bay Aquarium has been closed to the public since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. Do the fish in the aquarium notice the empty hallways? Do they wonder where the people have gone? During the closure, the aquarium has been taking the public on live virtual dives in the Kelp Forest exhibit. Social media content creator and diver Patrick Webster has agreed to take me with him on a virtual dive to explore the Kelp Forest.
The thing here, Joshua, about the Kelp Forest exhibit is that it's just like a forest on land, except it's underwater.
When you're a diver, you can actually look up at the Kelp Forest and you get this view that most people never see. Is it possible to capture that?
Oh yeah, we can do that right now. So this right here is often what we will call the Kelp Cathedral, where you just have these columns of kelp that are reaching up to the surface. This is like being in a redwood forest or in a very tall Monterey pine grove here in the area. And just to have this vertical component of this giant algae reaching all the way to the surface, then spreading out on the top as a canopy, blocking out the sun, making it harder for other organisms to compete with it, and then creating all that food for different organisms, but also creating the structure, as it's known, for fish to hide in and among, and also substrate for other animals to live on. What you don't have on a giant kelp plant are roots. What you have instead is what's known as a holdfast. Kelp forests are some of the most productive marine ecosystems on the planet. They produce billions of tons worldwide of kelp, and that's a lot of carbon that's been taken from the atmosphere, brought down into the ocean, then sunk away. So these kelp forests are really crucial as well as we think about what we need to do to tackle climate change, try and preserve our systems.
Kelp forest ecosystems also provide crucial habitat for animals like sea otters and gray whales. But in recent years, scientists have observed a significant decline in California's kelp forests.
We can see here, these are some absolutely massive red sea urchins. If I put my hand up to them, you can see just how much bigger they are than your typical urchin. You might see these animals might live over 200 years, and they're really the perfect counterpart to the prodigious growth ability of the kelp. When everything's balanced out, there's enough kelp to sustain the herbivores, so if the herbivores don't get too hungry and come out and mow down everything. When things get out of balance, if there's too many urchins showing up with not enough predators around, you can get into situations where the urchins end up crawling out here on top of the reef and end up trying to eat all of the kelp, thus creating what's known as an urchin barren.
Endangered sea otters eat sea urchins.
You need all the different players playing their positions on the field for the environment to do the best that it can. And so that's why we work here at the aquarium to think about rescuing baby sea otters that don't have a home range and then releasing them out into the wild, into zones where they used to live historically but haven't been in several hundred years. Being able to build up that resilience of the kelp forest by having more of the animals that are supposed to be there interacting with each other.
Has diving and spending all this time underwater changed the way you think?
Once you start seeing all this life, all this diversity, things that look so completely different from you, living out an existence longer than yours, like that sea urchin hanging out in the same spot for over 200 years, you start realizing that there is this entire other world that lives on the exact same planet. We fundamentally are descendants of organisms that went from the ocean onto the land. We never should have named this planet Earth. It was always planet Ocean.
I asked Dr. Rebecca Albright, a coral biologist at the California Academy of Sciences, what does it feel like to dive on a coral reef?
It's quiet, you're immersed under the water, you're weightless, you see this life that you didn't see from the surface. You have this window into this alternate world that you're just so lucky to be like a visitor to. It's incredible. It's the most special thing.
Dr. Albright developed a love for coral while diving on Australia's Great Barrier Reef, but her first diving lessons were in the Midwest.
I was always drawn to water. I got certified to dive when I was 17 in the middle of a limestone quarry in Ohio, where the instructions for a navigation dive were, swim till you hit the sunken refrigerator and then turn left until you hit the sunken school bus.
Threatened by a host of problems, including ocean acidification and climate change, coral reefs throughout the world are endangered.
Coral reefs cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, but they host 30% of biodiversity. And a lot of biodiversity hasn't even been explored yet. We don't even fully understand the complete biodiversity that we're losing in these areas.
Dr. Albright's work has focused on coral spawning.
We think there's somewhere between 600 and 800 different coral species worldwide. And we think about 75% of those reproduce sexually once a year through a mass spawning event. They only have one shot, we think, at sexual reproduction. They will reproduce asexually, but you're not gaining any genetic diversity. And in a time when there's rapid environmental change, you need as much diversity as possible.
Dr. Albright and her colleagues were the first scientists within the United States to successfully spawn coral in a lab setting.
This spawning event usually happens in late summer after a full moon, after sunset. And it varies a little bit depending on the species. And in order to simulate that in a lab, you have to provide them year-round with temperature cues that mimic a summer and a winter. You have to provide them with lunar cues that mimic full moons and new moons. You have to provide them with different frequencies and wavelengths of light and intensities to mimic sunrises and sunsets. And it's really quite sophisticated and quite challenging. And it only happens once a year. So you wait a year, see if you did it. And if you didn't, tweak it and wait another year.
During the first months of the pandemic in 2020, there was another breakthrough when the coral spawned for a second consecutive year in the lab.
These are corals we sourced from Palau in 2019. They spawned in 2019 at the same time as their native populations. We kept them for the whole year on that Palauan cycle. They experienced summer, winter, and then they respawned at the same time as their native populations. And that, it was just champagne, and it was just so exciting.
Scientists hope this work will aid with coral research, conservation, and restoration efforts.
Science has amazing capacity to rescue, come up with solutions, and come up with creative ideas. We can take corals into conservation breeding efforts. We can create super corals. We can restore corals at mass, but it's still not going to address the societal issue that we have 7.6 billion of us, and we need a lot of people to care about this issue and then act in meaningful and responsible ways.